Hey guys, so I ideally wanted to wait until the ban list came out to do this meta tier list body data, but you know what, it's clearly not coming out right now, so I figured I might as well just go on with it, and I think we can maybe just talk about how things might shift in terms of, post ban list for some of the decks that are going to be listed, and also it will provide a pretty good reference point as well once the ban list actually does come out. So I basically used data from Dueling Book as well as YCS and regional topping level information from just the past couple of weekends. And as always, definitely go check out my discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh singles as well as sleeves and other supplies. Links in description down below. And of course, definitely a big shout out to Ivan and YGOProduct.com as well in terms of maintaining all the regional and YCS level topping information. Anyways, let's just get to the tier list for this month, and hopefully things kind of shift around a little bit post ban list. I mean, for now, and if you watch my recent regional report top breakdown video about a week ago, you'll know that Pure Snake Eye has actually overtaken Fire King Snake Eye in terms of representation. I think the players are thinking it is a bit more consistent approach compared to like Fire King, but obviously they're both very, very strong decks. Really, both of these decks are in a league of their own. And you know what? Even with the ban list looming, I'm not exactly sure they would really destroy these decks anyways. I really doubt that. I think they would probably still end up being like the best decks, but perhaps in terms of representation, it actually becomes kind of pegged down at least and become a little bit more equal to something like Voiceless Voice as well. In that case, of course, outside of these two decks, Voiceless Voice so far definitely the most represented among all the other decks. Again, but still leagues behind something like Snake Eye and Fire King. But who knows? Maybe post ban list things will get a little bit more equal. You also have some other decks like Keshira. Of course, the only concern for this deck, perhaps with the ban list, is like Dimension Shifter, which is of course a very, very strong card on its own. But Keshira is shown to be quite resilient, and Unicorn is a pretty strong card. Would I invest in this right now? I'm not too sure. I mean, would they really hit Shifter though? As much as a lot of us want that, Konami has shown that they really love that card, so maybe Keshira is actually pretty safe for now. And then now we also have branded Despia, kind of at the similar level of representation as Keshira. This has been doing quite well at regional level. Is definitely getting some tops here and there as well at the YCS level. Of course, the very obvious card to be hit in this deck, which most likely will, is Sanctifier to prevent that gimmick lock, but also for something like Voiceless Voice to stop that Jargon lock as well, which is of course very toxic, should not exist. The one thing though with something like Sanctifier getting banned though, it really depends also how much they hit Snake Eye and Snake Eye Fire King, because one of the strengths rather for branded Despia in that matchup in particular is the fact that the Snake Eye board is not actually all that oppressive. It's just the fact that they can clap back really strong every time. And so one thing with branded Despia is even going second, having that gimmick lock prevents them from being able to come back with such force, and really gives a decent option and advantage for branded Despia. But with that being gone, with Sanctifier, if it were to get banned, of course it's gonna take a pretty notable hit. But at the same time, I'm pretty confident in this deck in terms of how much it can adapt, as you would see from, let's say, Nightfall's DB Grinder replay videos. A lot of times he's winning without even bothering with the gimmick lock. So next you have Flunder, and speaking of Shifter, that's obviously the main concern for this deck if you were to play this post ban list whenever that ends up coming out. At the same time, at least from a price standpoint, I can't imagine the deck getting that much more expensive if, let's say, Shifter does not get hit. This is actually a pretty affordable deck, especially when the extra deck doesn't really matter for the most part. So I think it's still solid, definitely a nice budget alternative to really stay relevant competitively. But Shifter getting banned would be really big for this deck, especially not only is Shifter strong in itself, but that also means that Flunder will now be a lot more susceptible to draw, which they technically are right now. It's just that something like Shifter does protect them from draw, so it kind of becomes like a double whammy for them. Although they of course have been, I've seen some plays of, let's say, Dimensional Fissure, which is one way to get around that. Next, you have something like Runic Stun. You can definitely go check out my recent video I posted, I guess last night, in terms of kind of rise of stun decks, at least at the regional level, and some of the most popular floodgates that are being played. Runic version of the stun is definitely by far the most popular. There's kind of different other variations, let's say with Horus stuff, and even something like kind of quote-unquote pure with like Dogmatica, and something like the Decisive Battle of Gondola that kind of provides some protection as well. So Runic. Also, I don't think I mentioned this in the ban list prediction video I made, but hopefully if they were to make big enough hits to Snake Eye and Fire King, then, some Runic cards hopefully actually gets hit again, because it really got some slap on the wrist. Fountain Tattoo really didn't do anything to begin with. So, that is something, especially because since Konami has shown that, they typically don't like to have a lot of like really strong draw cards in the game. Next we have Mannadium. This has definitely taken a lot of fall back since, you know, the Snake Eye Fire King format started with, I mean, Droll. It does still see a good amount of play, but I would say a lot of times I think it's been more so delegated to the side now compared to the main at the beginning of this format. But, you know, nonetheless, Mannadium still continues to not have as much success as before. It was really in that like tier 1 conversation before this, like, you know, Snake Eye stuff started. But you know what? It did recently top the YCS the most recent weekend, so it's kind of encouraging to see. So next we do have Salamangreat, which I'm sure is going to be a pretty surprising, especially at like a tier 2 level. It certainly caught me off guard when I first saw this on the scores, especially so when it actually ended up getting score higher than Labrynth, which is really weird, right? And you know, you could argue, yeah, I think overall maybe Labrynth is a better deck, but at least from a competitive event success standpoint. So for example, the past weekend at YCS, Salamangreat did top, Labrynth had 0 tops, and I thought maybe it's just like a one-off thing. But you know what? The YCS prior to that, YCS Sydney, Salamangreat again topped that event, and Labrynth had 0 tops in that event as well. So you know what, competitively, especially at the YCS level, I think Salamangreat has actually shown to be pretty decent, and at the very least I think it deserves a lot more competitive respect. Next we have Pearly. This is actually pretty solid right now, I think, as well, especially, you know, whether it post banless or not. I think, you know, you're not seeing a lot of Pearly specific hate anymore, like let's say D-Barrier or something like Herald of the Abyss, as well as even like Book of Moon, Book of Eclipse, when that was played more so for a cashier, but it also happened to work against something like Pearly as well. You're not really seeing that right now, which is kind of nice for them. They also, I've seen at least a lot of the lists playing like something like D-Fissure in the side as well, so I think it's actually a pretty solid like rogue choice at the very least, maybe even tier 2. I'm sure you could argue that as well. And post balance, I think it's already had some multiple hits already. I don't see why they would hit it again, at least at this point, so I think it's actually pretty solid. Next we have Spright. So this is obviously kind of weird to say rogue, but you know what, this is actually a little bit step up compared to what it was last month, where it really had almost no tops, at least even at a regional level. Right now it has a bit. You know what, it is a really consistent deck. I do have still some confidence in this deck. It's just, you know, in a format where there's a lot of destruction and pops happening, Spright tends to kind of struggle going second against those kind of interruptions. So now, speaking of powered elements, we also have tier limits, which honestly, every time I face this deck, I feel like it's still super strong. And recently, I've been noticing, you know, that Paleozoic tier element list that I believe topped at least one regional. I think it's pretty cool. It plays something like that Needle Bug Nest or whatever, that like mills 5, it's a trap. And they have a lot of their Paleozoic traps that keep like coming back as you activate other traps. So I find it takes a long time to actually get through their board and actually be able to finish them off. So you know what? Post banless, if especially like Shifter gets hit, that's certainly something to, you know, it'd be a very big win for Telements. So then we have Rikas on Avalon. You can actually check my recent deck profile I did with Samuel, who finished top 8 at a regional in Australia, and he actually talks about, you know, he has a lot of enthusiasm and confidence in this deck in the current format, as well as even, you know, post balance. I'm sure they already got some multiple hits, which by the way was kind of a pretty big surprise in terms of the number of hits they got when they weren't even a tier 1 deck. They did get some recent Aromage support, and you know, post whatever this balance may be, I'm sure they won't be hit any further, and I think it would actually be a pretty solid option as well. So next we have Rescue Ace. Now this is really weird to see, right? I mean, really, it was just a couple months ago where this was by far the most represented deck, and you know, even though it is a fire deck, I mean, I guess people just opted for Snake Eye or Snake Eye Fire King, or just not at all. So really interesting to see, especially at a regional level event, it's still continuing to kind of struggle, at least. At the same time, I think, you know, again, depending on the magnitude of this next balance, maybe Rescue Ace actually ends up coming back, because I think the ability to have those, like, you know, multiple sets as well as some form of monster interruptions as well, that always makes it a pretty hard board to kind of deal with, and I do think that, you know, it still has potential to come back in terms of competitive success. So next we have Vanquish Soul, which certainly has fallen off in terms of representation since this Snake Eye format started, but at the same time actually kind of hanging in there recently. It's another deck that can play Shifter. It can actually play a decent amount of non-engine, and the hand traps like, you know, Bell, Ash, like the Earth, the Fire, it kind of happens to synergize with their strategy in terms of having to reveal different attributes. And you know what? Steven Santoli, of course, really good player. I've mentioned this before in terms of, you know, he finished second place at Niagara Regionals playing this deck. So, I mean, you know, you can definitely go check out his channel, but obviously there's some promise there. And then we have Centur-Ion. Now this deck has of course fallen off a lot as well. I mean, really not to blame the deck directly itself, again, it's just more so the Snake Eye Fire King tier 0 stuff kind of happening. You know, banlist wise, I mean, I know a lot of people initially would have said, hey, you know, maybe Calamity should actually get banned, and is it ban worthy? Definitely. but I think at this point Centurion's not doing anything, and whatever this ban list comes, I can't really imagine them banning Calamities at this point, not until they're actually, if they do become like, you know, a tier 1 contender. Obviously they're going to get some new support at some point, so you know, I think for now I don't think there's really any kind of direct hits for Centurion at this point. So next we have Dragon Link. Always weird to see this in Rogue, especially when, you know, I'm just used to this always being like a tier 1 strategy. At the same time, you know what, I think, you know, whenever you have like a big ban list and the format's kind of unclear, I think Dragon Link always kind of can stand out as, you know, a pretty confident strategy to go with, just because it is very, very reliable. The absolute number of bestials that they play, I mean, is it really advantageous right now against, if let's say with the ban list, let's say Voiceless Voice now happens to become, you know, a lot more represented, and branded, or rather bestial cards go really hard against Voiceless Voice, with like the Snake Eye stuff, you know, being able to banish IP still is actually pretty relevant against branded if they still end up being pretty strong post ban list, which I'm sure they will. Of course, bestials also go really hard with that strategy, so I do think there's some promise with Dragon Link as well. And lastly, you know, moving on to the final tier, we do have Branded Chimera, definitely fallen a lot ways back beyond Despia, but you know, you never know with that ban list. You know, let's say maybe they actually do end up becoming kind of side by side once again. Obviously, they're not going to hit anything like Chimera Fusion or anything. If they do actually directly hit Branded Fusion, that will still affect this deck too, because, you know, it is one of the ways for them to kind of access like their Chimera stuff as well. Fenrir is another one that, you know, this deck typically plays it at 3. It just likes to get some hand advantage, but you know what, that might, who knows, maybe actually gets limited or semi-limited, but that's obviously not going to be a big difference at all for this deck. So I think this is actually going to be pretty solid as well. You know, something like if, let's say, Branded Opening or Aluber gets hit like it has been in the OCG, Branded Chimera, for the most part, at best, they play maybe like 2 openings, like 1 Aluber. So it's really, again, not going to be affecting them that much either. It's just that Branded Fusion directly. So I think for the most part, this is a pretty solid Rogue choice. And then finally, we have Raid Raptor. Again, we're only talking about 2 past weekends worth of events, so that's why there's not as much Raid Raptor. And overall, post Phantom Nightmare, it has actually had a handful of regional level tops so far. And ban list wise, I don't think there's really that much to worry about. You know, like Kali Yuga, even though it's not really an issue right now, because it's along the likes of Calamities. Maybe it does get banned in like the future if some tier 1 deck happens to abuses it again. But at this moment, you know, even the Raid Raptor lists that are topping aren't really playing Kali Yuga anyways, it seems. So I don't think there's that much to worry for this deck. I think it's can be fairly strong, really scary when it gets to go first, especially being able to put up not 1 but, you know, maybe up to 3 towers, with one of them being like 5300 attack, you know, especially against something like Banded Despia or Flunder, where they really traditionally struggle against like tower like monsters. I think Raid Raptor, you know what, a pretty fun rogue option moving forward. Anyways, guys, that was it for the meta tier list by the data for this month, pre-ban list. Really curious to see how this is going to shift, you know, next month when I do this, when there's, of course, hopefully a ban list actually in place. So really curious to see. Hopefully it does come soon. You can definitely go check out one of my recent videos I did where I try to predict when the ban list will come out based on kind of quote-unquote past trends. Anyways, huge thanks to all of you for watching this video. A big thanks to my Patreons and sponsors as always, and well, take care, guys.